Well, looks like it's time to start. Apologize for not having my lovely face on the screen there. We're just going to have to look at these pretty slides I got for you instead. There's a little bit of technical issues. But we're going to finish up our talk about the flood today, focusing on what we're finding in all these sedimentary layers, all these fossils, all this death. Again, Genesis 6 through 8 are our main verses. Overview is, from the last few times, all of creation was judged because man had dominion over all creation. No alone was seen as righteous in this generation, so only he and his family, whom he represented, were saved. We went through the timeline of the flood the last few times, so I'll just let it there for your guys' referral. Now, the world before the flood, the pre-flood world, was vastly more diverse. We talked about this a few lessons ago. Here's a list of all the classes and orders that have gone extinct. And remember, mammal is a class as far as our modern taxonomy goes. Now, not all of these are animals. They're probably plants, fungi, a whole bunch of stuff in there, invertebrates. But the world before the flood was vastly more diverse than our current world. Now, humans, there were probably anywhere from 200,000 to 17 billion people at this time. There's a large gap there because there's a lot we don't know. We don't know if people could have a child every year or every other year. Was it every decade as the birthing rate ramped up? Or was it every year that Adam and Eve were having a child? How bad was the violence? Was there a person being killed every day, multiple people a day? And so some of those assumptions will either lead us to the higher or lower end. And remember, we're having a lot of horizontal and vertical tectonics, and that is going to create a lot of volcanism and especially a lot of earthquakes. Those earthquakes are going to be there both during and after the flood as things kind of cool down. And all those earthquakes are going to be causing massive, massive tsunamis, which is what laid down a lot of the sediments. We also had a lot of volcanoes erupting all over the earth, massive, truly massive amounts of debris, ash, and lava being put out into the environment. Now, as things slowed down towards the end and after the flood, these eruptions became less and less until we get to our modern eruption level. But this would have been all over the earth during and after the flood. And these earthquakes were truly horrific. They were just monumentally greater than what we have today. The speed of the plate movement, as well as the speed of the vertical tectonics, would have been much, much faster. Again, some as fast as 22 miles per hour as far as movement of a plate. Then that means that the movement of the earthquake, the snapback of the top plate that causes the earthquake, would have been that much more. In short, these would have been megaquakes. And we can see some things today and match them with known earthquakes and see their effects. So today, when we have sand, there are these random pockets of water, and if you look at the top right, it has an image of that. If you vibrate that sand or shake it like an earthquake, all that water, all those pockets are going to be shot up. And this is called a fluid avulsion structure. You can see one down at the bottom right. I believe that's in the Dead Sea, where you can see these laminated layerings because there's nothing living there. Remember, no bioturbinates to dig up and move the soil. But you can see the ruler. These are very, very small. But when there's an earthquake, we can see little fluid avulsion structures in these layerings. And this basically can be used to gauge the severity of an earthquake. So we can see these things, match them to known earthquakes in the history, in our recorded history, and then get some sort of guideline of how to measure earthquake severity based upon these fluid avulsion structures. And these also cause other things like sand boils, which is basically like a sand volcano, and even quicksand via liquefaction. So if you have a house or a car that's on the sand, during an earthquake, it can sink. So don't build your house on the sand. But with known Dead Sea earthquakes, we can see that we get a decent size fluid avulsion structure. For the 7.2 Richter scale, we get a 3-inch, and you can see a picture of that in the top right. For a 8 on the Richter scale, which is 16 times as powerful, we get a doubling of that. And we can see this with a few other earthquakes, so we can get a good kind of measuring system here. So every doubling of height seems to be a 16 times as powerful earthquake. And what we're finding in these flood sediments are 6 foot 24 foot, and some even as big as 40-foot fluid avulsion structures. These were truly just drastically large earthquakes, and these were the ones that would have been in the middle and late in the flood, or even after the flood. So these would have been the smaller ones. We also have evidence of earthquakes vibrating a mountain chain miles, I should say. And the entire coast, the west coast of California, seems to be a massive rock slide. So basically the previous continental shelf was vibrated off and fall over into the sea, which created California, or at least a good portion of it. We see brecciations, just rocks that have just been obliterated for miles and miles because of these massive earthquakes. There's a lot more information that you can find out there. So if you really have an interest in this, hopefully you can find some of those resources at the end and dig a little bit deeper. And we also have a lot of impacts in these layers. In the year of the flood, we have 71 impacts of asteroids noted. May have been more that we just haven't found yet, but we have found 71 impacts that are in these flood sediments, meaning they occurred in about the time span of a year. There are 39 others that occurred after the flood. So an evolutionary rate would give 1 out of 8.5 million years, eventually becoming 1 out of 750,000 years. So it's a speeding up process, basically, for the evolutionary model. And then there is a tenfold increase with what we're seeing today. So it seems like things are wrapping up, or speeding up as far as impacts if you hold to the evolutionary theory. Doesn't really match what we're seeing, though. Biblically, what we're seeing is that in a single year, we had 71 impacts, then an average of 1 every 112 years afterwards. But that's an average. Most likely, it would have been in a decreasing rate, with the majority being just post-flood and then slowing down afterwards, like we're seeing with every other aspect of the flood mechanism. The most notable is the Chicxulub impact, and that's because this is the one that they claim killed the dinosaurs. They've given a number of other reasons why the dinosaurs died out, but this is the current favorite, followed by the remnants evolving into birds. We already went over why that doesn't fit. But this is truly a very large impact. It's a 124-mile wide impact crater in Mexico, on the Yucatan Peninsula there. But how could this affect the dinosaurs all over the world? You can see in the top right, over the map of the US, all those little multicolored dots are dinosaur bone beds. You can go online, you can select for these, and I'll give you the website a little bit later. Then we have a model of an impact overlaying that map there. So if this hit, it would truly be devastating for the area around it. It's a 124-mile impact crater. It was not a small impact. But no model can show how this would have affected all these dinosaur beds here. These dinosaur beds are 1,500 miles away from the heart of the disaster and over 1,000 miles long. And the thickness of this layer is constant all the way through this area of dinosaur beds, this dinosaur bone beds. This layer is hundreds of feet of mud, sand, and volcanic material, full thickness all the way through. If this was from an impact like this, we should see the thickest near the coast and the thinnest near the top of North America. There's also a number of other problems with this, such as elevation and timing, and so it just doesn't fit in. But this is one of the kinds of impacts that we were receiving during the flood. It would have done its own massive amount of damage. Not global, but still very massive. And with this rate of impacts, we have seen this before in our lectures, specifically talking about the moon. The moon has these Marias, if you remember, those big dark areas, those dark circles that you can see on the surface of the moon. These are basically hardened lakes of lava. They were most likely caused by impacts, truly massive impacts, that broke through lava or magma, whatever you want to call it, on the moon, rose up, and then solidified. We can see impacts and get a rate for impacts because we have what were called ghost craters. The image next to the moon there, you can see one, the bigger one with a bunch of little other craters inside it. These craters had to have occurred during this solidification process, so while this lava was solidifying into the basalt. That's why it is only a partial crater. The more firm, the more sharp the crater is, the closer to the solidification ending process into the process it would have hit. But this can give us a rate, and it's a very fast rate, a rate that does not match the evolutionary supposed rate, but does match the biblical rate. This also points to this not being a simple global event, but potentially even a solar system-wide event. This was truly a great judgment. And I can't help but just be in awe of the power of our God, who can create such massive effects. Mars and Venus also have some of these events, some of these evidences that seem to suggest that they were also affected. But this was truly a gigantic judgment that was placed upon us at this time, and I could only imagine the violence and the sin that would have warranted this. But shifting gears a little bit, we're going to focusing on the fossils. So we went through all this destruction that was occurring. Just to summarize, Noah in the ark and the people that would have been there or in the early parts of the flood would have experienced massive earthquakes, humongous waves. They would have known about this for a time, for weeks even, maybe even months, having no idea what was causing, or maybe they did, maybe they remember what Noah told them. But Noah and his family would have seen these impacts, seen the stars seeming to fall from the sky as these impacts occurred, seeing the moon red with lava. I can only imagine their fear. It is a truly terrible experience, and it's something that I don't think I would want to experience. I do not want to be on that ark. I'm thankful that I'm not. But I'm also thankful that we do have the same saving promise that Noah had. So when the judgment comes again, we have that promise. But as far as the fossils go, Scripture tells us very little. All we know is that all land animals and man were killed. Some will suggest that the fossils were created by God in the creation week. But in the fossil layers, in these bones, we have evidence of animal death, as well as disease, cancer, and all kinds of just bad processes. And it would definitely change our understanding of God's character for him to put evidences of death, decay, and just corruption in his perfect creation. And then not tell us about it, so when we find it, it seems like there was something going on, something bad going on. And so it does not fit with what we know of God's character. And we don't need to hold to that because we have a much better explanation for this, both scientifically and scripturally, since we have basically a smoking gun in the scripture that formed this, the flood itself. But we also need to be careful about how we approach fossils. You can see in the image on the right the supposed whale evolution. You will see images like this with a full skeleton and a body imprint behind it, a silhouette. And it gives the impression that this is what we find in the fossil record, though it is not the case. We need to be sure that when we're looking at fossils that we know how much of that is actually found and how much of that is drawn in. For example, the skull in the bottom center, only the grayed out area is what they found. Everything else is what they put in themselves, even more so with the body silhouette. And so be careful when you're looking at fossils to figure out how much is actually there, what the data actually is, and how much they've just assumed and put in to fit whatever they're trying to get done. But we do have quite a bit of fossils. There are over 250 million fossils found and cataloged. I'm sure that some of you may even have found fossils, little pieces of coral, maybe a shell, something like that. There are tons of them. But 95% of the fossils that we have are shallow marine invertebrates, basically clams, stuff like that. The remaining 5%, 95% of those are algae and plants. The 5 remaining percent, the majority are invertebrates, basically like insects and kind. Even less, the vertebrates, the majority of those are fish. So we have very few actual vertebrate fossils of land-dwelling animals. There's not a lot of them. And the ones we have, though, while they are very well preserved as far as having bones, having details, most of them are disarticulated, meaning that they are torn apart limb from limb. They're a piece here, a piece there. The pieces are very well preserved, but we don't have whole organisms for a lot of what we see. Only about 3% of fossils are somewhat complete. Now, these are the ones we like to look at because they're the coolest ones. But these fossils are basically all been just incredibly destroyed. We're only getting the fragments of them. We can also see where they're laid. So PaleoDB is the website where you can go in and look at actual fossils and where they're found. And you can see patterns across continents. So you can see South America and Africa there. there are some plants that are found on both continents, as well as the graphic in the bottom right, some animals. This is another piece of evidence that suggests that all the continents were in one place, which we've already went over why that is a good fit for the flood and the flood model that we're going over biblically. But just another piece of evidence for you. But all these things we cannot be sure are in the correct environments. They're going to be mixed around because these flood waters would have been moving things, mixing things, and laying them down in incorrect places as far as their environments go. We know this because we found coral preserved in carbonate mud. Mud is not a great place for coral to grow, meaning that this was not the land, the earth that was picked up with the coral and placed with it wherever it was placed. Coral, when it grows in mud, will sink and die. Now, if we assume that the nearest hard surface was where the coral was growing, that the land that it was growing on wasn't obliterated, then it would be quite far as its movements. And these seem to be in an east-to-west pattern, as we already went over as far as the movement of the waters. There are many other things like this, such as the coelacanth being found with dinosaurs, though today it is a deep-sea fish, and many other such poor mixing of known environmental animals. But how do we get a fossil? Well, it requires rapid burial. Without being buried, carnivores and scavengers will destroy it. And that's why we don't have any buffalo remains, any buffalo fossils. You will find many images, pictures, and paintings of both settlers and Native Americans killing buffalo. It was a lucrative business. You'll see Native Americans running them off cliffs. You'll see a settler sitting on top of a mountain of skulls. They were truly destroyed as far as hunting them out of near to extinction. But there's not a single fossil. That's because they were not buried. And you have to bury them quite deep. Scavengers can dig pretty deep to get to that meat. You also have to dig them or bury them so deep that even the oxygen-breathing bacteria can't reach them. So all these aerobic, air-breathing bacteria, these decomposers, can reach down as far as 30 feet, even in a shallow marine environment. So even in the Gulf Coast, you have to dig 30 feet deep before you don't get decomposed by these aerobic bacteria. And even worse, you carry your own bacteria with you. All of us have gut flora, gut bacteria that don't need air. They don't need oxygen. And so they can decompose you from the inside out. So it is very, very hard to become a fossil. And even if you become a fossil, you can still get destroyed by erosion and movement of the sediments, such as the Tejas megasequence. When it was running off, it probably destroyed vast amounts of fossils. So we have a very hard time getting these fossils, as it requires a very specific set of circumstances. Circumstances that we don't see today, but circumstances that fit the flood model perfectly. Yet there is a layer that we don't see fossils in, and that is the Precambrian fossil sedimentary or Precambrian layer, These layers have very few fossils, and the fossils that they have are mainly bacteria or algae, things that are not really animal-like. They're all microscopic. This is because the environment, the conditions at this layer are probably like the ones we find today, very unlikely to get fossilization. And then suddenly something changes, and then it goes back to what we see today. This fits perfectly with the flood model, not so much with the evolutionary model. And then in the earliest flood sediments, we get something called the Cambrian explosion. Now, evolutionists have a very hard time explaining this. In fact, they can't. You can see some quotes here. The sudden appearance of fully formed species in the fossil record without apparent evolutionary ancestors and mutant intermediate species is a major problem for evolutionists. Or most of the animal phyla that are represented in the fossil record first appear fully formed in the Cambrian. The fossil record is therefore of no help with respect to the origin and early diversification of the various animal phyla. They call it the Cambrian explosion because suddenly we see a lot of fully formed, diverse, detailed, complex organisms. These even have eyes. An eye is a very complex organ. It is impossible just to appear according to the evolutionary theory, yet that's what we have. There are also a few other problems with the sudden appearance of fossils. There are two things when you're looking at environments: disparity and diversity. Disparity is how different things are. Diversity is how many things you have. So if you had 5 dog kind. So you have a dog, you have a wolf, you have a coyote, you have a dingo, you have a fox. You have high diversity because you have a number there. Say you have 500 of those. High diversity. But you have low disparity because they're all basically the same, just slightly different. Now, high disparity and low diversity is just a fish and a bird. Not alike at all, and, well, basically there's only two of them, so it's low diversity. But since they're not alike at all, it's high disparity. I hope that kind of explains things. It is different from how we normally look at things, but evolutionarily, we would expect to find a large number of species before we get different kinds of species, like vastly different kinds. Again, multiple kind of dogs before we get anything else, bird, fish, cat, etc. But that's not what we're seeing. What we find is we find a high disparity and low diversity. In the Burgess Shale, which is a kind of sediment, when looking at arthropods, we find 21 species of non-trilobite arthropods. These 21 species fit in 21 classes. Remember, a class is basically like a mammal as far as the taxonomy goes. It should be very large, but we're only finding one species per class with one class that has two. That's incredibly high disparity. And it's even more disparity than what we find nowadays, because there are only 5 classes of non-trilobite arthropods that exist, meaning that first, according to the evolutionary theory, disparity was even higher than today. And that just doesn't make sense at all, since disparity should always increase as you get more organisms, more phyla, etc. We'll also have echinoderms, same pattern. This does not bode well for the evolutionary model, but it fits perfectly with the biblical model, because we expect that everything pre-flood would have been more diverse, more different from the day, and so we know that a lot of death and extinction has occurred since then, so we wouldn't expect it to match what we see today. Now, as far as order of appearance, you will frequently see tree of life depictions of the evolutionary model. One organism to another, etc., etc. Now, this isn't commonly done by the species or even the genus level, because there's always something shifting, and it's a lot of work. No one really wants to do that. But if we do it at the order level, and if you look back here on the picture on the right, the order is above the family. So biblically, this would be above the biblical kind if you're talking about vertebrates. Other organisms like invertebrates and stuff like that, we don't know. We have not researched that. We've not got to that point yet. We don't know where the biblical kind is for plants, etc. But the important point is that the order, we should see many different transitions. We should see a smooth going from one to the other in the geologic strata that we're finding here, if the evolutionary theory is true. Yet when comparing to the fossil record, the evolutionary tree of life at the order level, which should give them the best benefit of the doubt, doesn't match 95% of the time, which means 95% of the time we are not in the evolutionary order. Only 5% of the time is the fossil order matching what the evolutionary theory claims. And that 5% is in the appearance of sea to land organisms. You can see here orders of plants, or order of plant classes, sorry, this is classes. So basically, it does not fit well for the evolutionary model. Things are just appearing, not in the order that they would expect. And the evolutionary model would hold that we would expect to see A to B to C, kind of like that picture in the bottom. We would expect to see some slight changes, maybe not in the species level, maybe not in the genus level, but in the class and order level, definitely. There's just too many transition species that we wouldn't catch one. Yet what we're seeing is stasis and abrupt appearance, meaning that suddenly we get A and then it stays the same all the way up, and then disappears potentially. C, B, the same thing. We're not seeing any connections between these things that we're finding. This is very consistent with the flood model, but not consistent at all with the evolutionary model. And so what they will say is they will say that we just don't have a lot of fossils. They don't have, the fossil record isn't complete. And they use this method to determine that. So they try to figure out the area under the curve. So say we have 2 species today, and we only found 2 species in the entire fossil record. So it would be just a flat line at the number 2. And so basically we know the curve would be 2. Now, what they assume is they assume the same number of species today existed all the way back through their millions of years. And each species existed on average for about 25 million years. That's their lifespan of a species. And based upon this, they get less than 1% of the fossil record being complete. So they expect only to find 1% of all the fossils. There are a lot of assumptions in this. Is there another way that we can try to assume how complete the fossil record is? Well, we can look at today's animals and see if they're in the fossil record. So if we can look at today's animals, which remember, according to the evolutionary theory, half of them are only halfway through. So some of these animal species, some of these species, period, are at the very early of their 25 million year lifespan. Some are towards the end. And so we should only have fossils from about half of them at best. Maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less, but not a lot of fossils from the animals we see today. Yet what we see, as far as living land animal orders, remember, this is one step below class, one step below mammals. We see 97.7% have been in the fossil record. So 97.7% of the land animals we have today at the order level have been found in the fossil record. Now let's look a bit lower. Let's look at the family level. Remember, this would be the biblical kinds for land vertebrates. Of the 178 living families today, 87.8% have been found in the fossil record. Of the 80% of the living species of mammals in Europe are found in Europe's fossil record, and 99% of them are found worldwide. That means that the fossil record seems to be extremely complete. Now, we wouldn't expect to have all animals, all plants in the fossil record, but the vast majority seem to be in there based upon this data, actual measurable data today with the fused assumptions. And whenever you're trying to get a model, the model with the fused assumptions tends to be the most accurate. And this is exactly what we expect to find if there was a global flood. There are also a lot of odd fossils that we can find in here. For example, polystrate fossils. You've probably seen some trees like this. I'm not going to use a tree because I like animals instead, so we're going to use animals. For example, a whale fossil. This was reported to have been a 90-foot polystrate fossil. You can see a drawing of what it might have been. Now, this was moved by vertical tectonics, so it was laying flat, but the soil, the sediment underneath it, was moved, and so it appeared more vertical. But still, a whale on its side is a 6 to 10 foot polystrate fossil. A polystrate fossil is a fossil that is in multiple sediment layers. And according to the evolutionary theory, these layers are laid down very slowly, like a few inches to a foot per million years, or something along those lines, depending on the sediment. So that means that this whale had to have been buried over the course of millions of years for it to be as complete as this is. Does not make sense, since scavengers, decomposing, all that other stuff that would destroy fossils, prevent fossils that we all talked about before, would have had a massive effect on such a large carcass. We also have this ichthyosaur skull, which is kind of like a dolphin fish, a reptile dolphin. Now, basically this would have implanted itself in 15 inches of muck, according to the evolutionary theory, because it was found, as the middle picture there suggests, inside multiple layers. Now this skull is 15 inches long, and they say it was swinging around, then took a nosedive and embedded itself in these 15 inches of muck. The problem is that while the very surface may have been muck, the bottom layers would have been there for millions of years. They would have been solidified by then. So that means that this thing took a nosedive into solid rock and didn't harm its muzzle, or its nose, or beak, whatever you want to call that. That doesn't make sense. And it could have just been sitting there for millions of years as it was covered up. We also have nautiloids. These are basically little octopus squid things that have a cone shell on them. Think of it like a big dunce cap. Now, these are found in sediments that are supposedly deposited 1 inch per year. And these are found in the Grand Canyon. They have a nautiloid canyon there. Yet, many of these are 3 feet long, and you can see an end view of one, the end-on view. That is the cone there, with the finger pointing at the top right. There are many, many fossils in this canyon. That's why it's called Nautiloid Canyon. Some are horizontal, some are vertical like this. And the tip, or the base, whichever end would be up in this picture, would have been eroded off, leaving just this and whatever's still left in the soil, in the dirt there, or the sediment, I should say. These do not make sense underneath the long-age evolutionary model. We also have rapid burials. The ichthyosaur giving birth, a fish eating another fish. That means that they were buried very quickly. It means they're also buried very deep so that they would not have been decomposed. Very, very fast. You also see a lot of fragile fossils. We have a wasp there, a jellyfish, and an ink sac from a squid or an octopus. Excuse me. These things are very fragile. They had to have been buried again very quickly, and in such a way as not to destroy them. It doesn't make sense if they died and then landed in a stream and somehow got buried over years. It doesn't make sense. They would have been decomposed, and we have a lot of these. We also have odd burial poses. Now these are the most complete fossils. We don't have a lot of these. Remember, only about 3%, and that's not even including vertebrates alone. That's all fossils. Yet we have a lot of them found like this, with their necks bent over backwards at their hip. This has been shown in a study in Colorado with chickens, that whenever a chicken was choking and drowning in water, their neck would arch back like this. This shows that these were all water burials. This didn't just die and land in a stream, as you'll see in a lot of textbooks, and the water just gradually bury it over years. They were buried very quickly and in water and drowned. Evolutionists will also claim that you never find a fossil lower or higher than it should be. Yet we see birds in the Mesozoic layer, so with dinosaurs and such. Doesn't fit well for the dinosaur to bird evolution. We see numerous man-made objects in fossils. I've seen a car battery in a geode, or some sort of battery. I don't think it was a car battery. There are clams that are found in bottom layers, top layers, and every layer in between. Doesn't make sense for the evolutionary theory. The Smithsonian documented both bear and human footprints in a layer that was 250 million years old. But they can't say that it's human, so they have to say it's simian-like. Because humans didn't exist back then, 250 million years ago, so they can't say that they were human. Doesn't make sense. We have footprints of land creatures well before Tiktaalik, the supposed water to land creature transition. Again, this one was one of the ones that replaced the coelacanth that was shown to be false. And we have numerous other layers with footprints that then we don't see the animal for, according to the evolutionary model, tens to hundreds of millions of years. Yet remember, animals should not exist for that long. We should have fossils in that time period as well if things were going as slow as they are. Doesn't make sense with the evolutionary model. Makes perfect sense with the flood model, as sediments would have come in, some creatures would have survived that push of the water. They would have then been walking around on these newly laid sediments, basically like a sandy beach, leaving footprints behind, and then days, weeks, maybe even a little bit months later, they would have been killed by the next push of the flood, the next wave. We also see a lot of living fossils. We have turtles, spiders, starfish, bats, shrimp, alligators, lizards, a number of these things that have not changed for millions and millions of years, according to the evolutionary theory. They try to explain them away as that they're so well adapted to their environment that they don't change. Yet this requires that their environment has not changed in hundreds of millions of years, which both models don't hold to. The biblical model doesn't hold to that because things aren't that old, and even then we know environments change. The evolutionary model doesn't hold to that because the sediment layers are supposed changes in an environment. Yet still we see all these organisms not changing, not evolving. The coelacanth as well, we already talked about this for a bit, how it was supposed a transition species, yet it was found with dinosaur fossils, like in the same layers as dinosaurs, next to dinosaurs. Yet today we find them in the deep oceans, not doing anything of what evolutionists claim they've done. Basically, they always have some explanation trying to explain these things away. Either moving sediments, a chance flooding of a river, something along those lines. And a lot of the times they will say that they haven't changed because we see that they haven't changed. Therefore we know that they're perfect as far as their environment goes. They use a circular reasoning. We know it's this way because the evolutionary theory is true, and we see this today, so therefore it must exist this way. Never questioning their underlying assumption being the evolutionary theory. And quickly, I'm going to go over transitional fossils. This is probably going to be the least important thing in this lecture, but I know a lot of people have some issues with this. I say this is the least important because there's not really a lot of that we need to focus on with this. The evolutionary community is pretty good about disproving these transitional fossils themselves, so we don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. But just so that you can have some peace of mind, we're going to go over it. So my question is, what evolved first? Did the spoon evolve first, or did the pot evolve first? Now, some will say that we found the layers in this way. The pot was the deepest, and so it must have evolved in the spoon because the spoon's the top one. And could be the other way around. Maybe we found the spoon the deepest, and the pot was in the top layers. So maybe it went from a spoon to a pot. Say we found some sediment layers that were new, and we found a spoon below the pot. Well, then we changed it around. So now it's a spoon to the pot. But wait, something else. We found a new sample, and it has the pot with the lid, or the pot with the handle, being the lowest one. So now we know that it was a divergent evolution. I'm just trying to show you that all they're doing is taking images, basically, and putting them in any order that they like. It doesn't matter. All these are perfectly fine. They take a new piece of information, they find one deeper or higher, and they, oh wait, we're going to rearrange things now, so now it's like this. It's still just as accurate according to their theory. There's nothing other than image matching, basically, in these ideas. And you just prove one, a new one will pop up. And thankfully, we don't have to disprove them because the evolutionary community does that themselves. And you will often see them claim that we don't expect to find. Remember, they only think that less than 1% of the fossil record is complete. We don't expect to find species transitions. But when you're looking at orders and classes, you would expect to find some. There should be hundreds, if not thousands, of transition species in between one order turning into another order, or one class turning into another class. Yet we're not finding those. We'd expect to see them, but we're not finding them. And evolutionists tend not to focus on those. They focus on the species to species because it gives them the most wiggle room. Remember, 95% of fossils are shallow marine invertebrates. And there are no intermediate species with that. There's no transitional species in there. We do have two claims in the plant. So we have two claims of transition species in 5% of the fossil record. All the other supposed transition species are in the less than 1% fossil record, meaning the land vertebrates. Some marine vertebrates as well. I wonder if they do this either because they like to look at the land vertebrates, the marine vertebrates, because that's the most animal-like and what people like to work with. Or is it because they have the most wiggle room in this? They have the least amount of data, and so they are able to rearrange things how they'd like. Now, we wouldn't expect to see really any transition species, but we would expect to see species that have various design features. Some here, some there. And so it makes sense with the flood model that there wouldn't be very many supposed transition species that they could put forward. And thankfully, there are no uncontested transitional fossils, period, even by evolutionists. We don't really have to worry about disproving every single transition species. There have been many, many that have been disproven. Some disproven within the last few years. Homo naledi, a supposed ape to man transition species, was put forward and is now being hit hard by the evolutionary community themselves. So I just want you to not have to worry about this. If this is a question for you, there's a lot of information. If this is a worry, there is a lot of stuff you can dig into to confirm the biblical model, to confirm the Bible, and to allay those fears. We have duckbills being found in duckbill dinosaurs, ducks and goose kind, and even the platypus. We have many mosaics like the platypus with both fur, eggs, feet, and milk. So the feet of a duck, the egg of a bird, the fur of a mammal, and the milk of a mammal. Yet evolutionists will not claim that this is a missing link. It doesn't fit their model as such. Yet this is a mosaic, a creature that has various design features, and biblically we'd expect to find that. As a designer, we'd expect God to reuse certain designs to fit certain needs. Evolutionists tend to explain this away as convergent evolution, meaning the same thing evolved at a separate time and place, even multiple times. This occurs many, many times in the evolutionary model. Yet they have no mechanism for this. They simply say that the environments must push for this kind of evolution because we see it. Again, another circular reasoning point. They assume that the evolutionary theory is true, therefore this must be the case. Never again questioning the evolutionary model. There's always going to be a new transition species found. There's always going to be a new case of convergent evolution. There's always going to be a lot of these circular reasonings. And they're not a good way to approach somebody because they just will keep digging into that circular reasoning. So this is just here basically to assuage any fears you may have, any concerns you may have as far as transition species. If you have any questions about a specific transition species or fossil or anything like that, let me know. For the rest of the time we have, we're going to be looking at human fossils. Why we don't have them, or do we have them? Now, there are only 32 complete T-Rex skeletons that we have today. According to evolutionary theory, there would have been as many as 2.5 billion T-Rex fossils, or T-Rex on the Earth, sorry. That means that according to evolutionists, they have a fossil rate of 0.000001%. Yet they will claim that according to the biblical model, we would expect to see all these fossils that we're claiming as far as humans and deep layers and stuff like that, modern animals. Yet according to their theory, they wouldn't expect to see any fossils. So we need to make sure that we don't worry if they claim that, oh, you should have fossils, but you don't have fossils. I hope that I'm doing a poor job of explaining that, sorry, but it just shows that the evolutionary theory wouldn't expect fossils either, so why would they expect it with what we have here, with the biblical model? Now, the proposed fossilization rate of the T-Rex, even if there were 100 million humans, that means that if we had, 1 million humans alive pre-flood at the T-Rex fossilization rate, there would only be 0.01 fossils of humans. So a hundredth of a human found. That is 2 bones, give or take. Depending on if you want to count teeth in that, I guess, or not. So potentially 3 bones found in a human out of all the Earth at this fossilization rate. So we don't need to be worried if we don't find any human fossils, because the model themselves, the evolutionists themselves, claim that we wouldn't expect to find them. Yet, do we have any human fossils? We actually have quite a few. We have the Paluxy River in Tennessee, we have human footprints and dinosaur layers. We have the Taylor tracks. You can see here the dinosaur footprint, then later a human footprint stepped on it. We have the Albus Delft print. And this one, I believe that is a MRI, but it might be a CT, I forget. But basically, they showed that the mud underneath the footprints is denser, meaning that it was stepped on as it was wet. So these creatures stepped on first the human and then the dinosaur in the same mud when it was wet, which means it was not faked. And there are a lot of faked footprints, faked fossils. So you have to be careful about putting one forward, because unfortunately it is a very lucrative business to make these and sell these. So make sure that the appropriate research has gone into, the appropriate testing has gone into these before you start using them. This is the Zapata track that was in the Smithsonian magazine that I talked about. This is the supposed simian-like footprint. I can't say more than just look at it. That looks like mine or another person's footprint. And there are also mammals and birds in this. Now, do we have others? Do we just have footprints? Because they could explain them away as simian-like. Well, we do have human fossils. In the 1970s, in a copper mining company in Utah, there were 2 fossilized human skeletons found, buried in deep dino layers, basically underneath 15 feet of material and solid rock. In the 1990s, 8 more skeletons were found, including a woman and an infant. Now, these bones overall were buried 50 feet in undisturbed, hard layers of limestone. They were tested old via carbon dating and with no detectable collagen, meaning that they were old. Not millions of years old, but old. They were found in what the evolutionists would call millions of years sediment. Yet here we find human fossils, human remains, that's even been turned green, I believe, because of the copper in there. Many of them, in fact. Yet these are frequently explained away as moving dirt, placement, or just falsehoods. Yet this does not allow for that, since they were found in solid rock. We have many, many others. I do have here, I removed them for time's sake, but you can look at some of the resources and hopefully find them. There are quite a few, far more than what we'd expect. If humans were in the Tejas megasequence, being one of the last to be buried by the flood, because they would have expected something to happen with all the earthquakes and everything, then we wouldn't expect to find many. Even if there were 10 million people that were alive at the time of the flood, that means that there is one human per 70 kilometers cubed worth of sediment. That's quite a bit. And that's assuming that none of these human fossils, none of these human remains were destroyed by the floodwaters or moved into the deeper oceans and subducted into the mantle. So that means none of these were destroyed. That would still only give us one human per 70 kilometers cubed. And remember, by some estimates, there may have been as little as 200,000 people, which would be even less. So we don't expect to find many human fossils, yet we found quite a few for what we expect. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper in that, this is very strong evidence, but they quickly try to sweep it under the rug with various excuses. And so we need to make sure as creation scientists that we do our due diligence, which a lot of organizations, a lot of ministries do use. So look at the resources, go through those. There's a lot of good information there. We have finally finished the flood, but we have not finished the effects of the flood. While the flood was over when Noah left the ark, the effects of the flood continued for many years afterwards. The Bible is not silent on this, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about this time period other than the Middle East, talking about Abraham and a few other things in this time period. But it glosses over it a little bit, the same way it glosses over the pre-flood period. We don't have a lot of information. But by taking what we do have from the Bible, specifically the flood, and the information we have today, we can get quite a bit of information on what the world would have been like at this time. And next 4 lessons, we're going to be going over that as far as the environment, the animals, and the people at this time. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, that's it for this morning. Thank you.